Hello, 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 Midland's Choice Realty. Hey, welcome to Broker Topics. Jonathan Howdershell here, Midland's Choice Realty. Just wanted to release a new video for everybody. We've got, half of 2024 in the books. We've got a little bit of loosening of the market, it seems like, and some more buyers are out there. Now willing to deal with higher interest rates, knowing that maybe there's no quick turnaround as far as going back to lower ones. So I feel like buyers are starting to get off the fence. Sellers, it's still a tough market. We're still low inventory. Historically speaking, over the last few years, the market has really kind of turned on its head for different reasons. But I hope everybody is able to, have proper consultations with potential buyers, listing appointments, working on getting those listings for fall, winter of 2024. Of course, everyone knows, please call me, text me, email anytime, and our team will be here to support you any way that we can. So today's topic is going to be, something I like to reinforce with each video, with each conversation I have with you folks is attention to detail, protect your license, protect your client's best interests. That's always the top priorities. Do a great job when you're out there. Understand the contract. Let me ask you this. Can the contract steer you wrong? Good question. Well, I'm going to address a couple points on that because if all signatures are in place, if all initials are recognized, if both parties, buyers and sellers, have come to terms, and the agents have done a good job of explaining the disclosures, the paragraphs in the contract, well, I'll tell you what, seems to me the contract can back you up, can provide the confidence to you and your clients that everything has been addressed, unless it's, some outside realm of possibilities, which do happen. I think the contract has been modified over the years. I think the contract committee that puts these together for us here in South Carolina has gone through, a lot of detailed conversations. They've gone through a lot of issues that have come up at closings and have tried to make the language as clear as possible to balance things that might happen. So let's talk about a couple things that could happen. One is the property disclosures. Specifically, I want to talk about the HOA disclosures. A lot of the planned communities have an HOA. You get buyers out there that often say, here's what I want. I want a beautiful home, lots of land, and no HOA. Well, when you have a consultation and you're working on a strategy in an area that they're looking for, looking to fit all their criteria into one package, we often find that there's no perfect property unless you've got the time and the money. Usually you're going to make some concessions about what's important to you as a buyer. And ultimately, in an area like Columbia and the surrounding greater Columbia areas, you're going to have some HOA. If you're looking to get into a more exclusive or amenity-based neighborhood, well, you're going to guarantee to have some HOA dues, some rules and regulations, and CCR/BR, which are the covenants, conditions, restrictions, and bylaws for the neighborhoods. So one thing that can come up on the property disclosure and during the process of closing a property, once you're under contract, the buyer has to do their due diligence. We know that it's part of one of the options under the due diligence period, inspection period. And even before they get under contract, they have to read and review the South Carolina Residential Property Disclosure Statement. Most homes are going to have that. There are some exceptions. I want to focus on the ones that do have it, and specifically the HOA. So I'm going to read this because it's really a buyer's process. The sellers are, of course, going to acknowledge any information that they know about their property within the time they've owned it. They're going to disclose various things. And so the sellers have a very big responsibility. The buyers have a very big responsibility. And I think sometimes buyers or buyer's agents don't explain some of the responsibility that a purchaser has. So agents, such as myself, yourselves, we also have a responsibility, even if it's not listed on a property disclosure. We want to make sure we pass on any potential defects that we are aware of on a property. An example I had recently was the home went under contract, property disclosures were signed. Well, a window got broken just before the inspection was done, small crack. You know, it was at the point where the buyer was already coming out to do their inspections. We didn't necessarily change property disclosures and say, oh, hey, wait, the window got broken. But we were expecting to see it on the inspection report. Well, the home inspector did not see the broken window. It was not in their report, and it was not on a repair addendum. So I definitely let my seller know, hey, I have to disclose to the buyer's agent, to the buyer, that I'm aware of a broken window, and we should, make them aware in case they want us to address it. So I verbally called the agent. I also put it in writing in an email saying, hey, thanks for the inspection reports and the repair addendum. Also, I wanted to let you know there's a broken window that was not acknowledged in this. Let's please, if your client thinks it's important, you can add it to the addendum and the seller will address it. That's the right thing to do. My seller said, oh, well, they didn't see it. I'm like, well, yeah, but we know of it. And so we don't want a final walkthrough to happen. And they say, hey, what about this broken window? When did that happen? And we're all standing around saying, oh, well, we knew about that. But we, chose not to tell you. That would be doing things the wrong way. We don't want to do that, right? Okay, so HOA, along with the other property disclosures, sometimes at closing, when you see on the settlement statement, HOA has various fees. A lot of times it's a capital contribution fee. Sometimes there is a balance due from the sellers. Sometimes there's a prorations involved on the current bill. Sometimes there's special assessments, which hopefully the seller is aware of those things. When you're marketing your home, you should be aware of any special assessments. A lot of times we're going to put down the contact information of the HOA. We're going to put down the typical quarterly fees or annual fees. We're going to talk about what is involved. A lot of times I will download the covenants, the various documents associated with HOA. You can get those directly from the HOA if you contact them. You can get them from the Secretary of State website. You can really research the different HOA entities, contact numbers. Sometimes they're downloadable documents, but it's also just a phone call away. Now, it's not the seller's responsibility to offer up all of the HOA restrictions and covenants. It is their responsibility to disclose the contact information, any fees associated with it, any special assessments offered, but they don't typically know everything that the HOA may or may have changed since they've owned the property. They don't know all the restrictions by heart. So the buyer really has to do their due diligence. And I want to read this. This is from the official disclosure statement, the addendum for the HOA, and it says, prior to signing contract, owner shall provide this disclosure addendum to the purchaser if the property is subject to a homeowners association, a property owners association, a condominium owners association, a horizontal property regime, or similar organizations. Okay, now it does say this. Purchaser should review the applicable documents, all related association issues, and investigate the owners association prior to entering into legal agreements, including a contract. So this is suggesting, well, it's making it clear that the purchaser should understand all these things before even signing a contract. Key point, purchaser. It says the owners association charges include any dues, fees, assessments, reserve charges, or similar charges. Purchaser is solely responsible to determine what items are covered by the owners association charges. Purchaser is solely responsible. So even though the seller has a responsibility, and I think most sellers do have some knowledge of what their HOA is doing, but most people don't pay attention to it. Most people are not active in it. Things could have changed. Capital contributions could have changed. And so it's really the buyer's sole responsibility. That's key. I did have a closing recently, and there was a large capital contribution. It was an amenities property with golf course and pools and tennis courts and outdoor spaces, soccer fields, all this sort of stuff. And so there's a pretty large capital contribution that is done, larger than most communities. The seller, when they purchased the home new. And I think at that time, the builders were working with the HOA or the community, and they were waiving any type of capital contribution as a perk to purchase a new property. So sellers may or may not have any knowledge of what a typical capital contribution is, because if they never paid it, they've never seen it, things have changed, fees have risen, fees have lowered, maybe a pool was added to a community that wasn't there before, so now the HOA is considerably more. Well, things can happen, but ultimately it's the buyer's due diligence, the buyer's sole responsibility to understand the dues before even signing a contract. So before even submitting an offer, one would say. So, you know, we did have something come up at closing. It was a fairly large capital contribution, and the buyer's agent said, "Hey, Jonathan, well, everything's going to work out. No worries. We were surprised to see this. And by the way, some feedback to you is we would have liked to seen some better disclosure on this capital contribution." I didn't take it upon myself to be offended. I mentioned, okay, well, that sounds great. The sellers were not aware of it. Maybe things have changed. They did not have a capital contribution when they purchased the home. I would suggest that it's part of the buyer's due diligence to understand that. But I kind of left it very vague. It didn't seem like it was going to be a big problem. And so if it had become a big problem, maybe I would have said a few more things like, you know, let's review the property disclosures, let's review the contract language, and let's understand clearly that's the buyer's sole responsibility to understand the fees. Now, also, I'll say this. The closing attorney, which is selected by the buyer typically, has the duty to contact HOA, to get any assessments, any fees that come along with the transfer of an HOA into the new community, or from the new buyer into the community. And the closing attorney should have this ready to explain what exactly it is and talk about it to the purchaser. I think one of the reasons why this happened, and we had separate closings, so we had the sellers come in a little earlier. The buyers weren't able to come in until later in the day from their work schedule, so they came in after we had signed. You know, there was the pre-disclosure from the lender 3 days prior to the closing, and then we had settlement statements that I reviewed with my clients before the closing. I can't tell you exactly what the buyers and buyer's agents did. We were aware of, all the numbers looking like they worked out correctly. So the buyer should have known this before closing, but apparently they did not. And the attorney explained it as they weren't certain what it was. It looked like a capital contribution. And then the buyer's agent said, well, is this a special assessment? And so when they called me and talked to me about this, I said, well, let me pull it up. Here, it looks like it says clearly on the settlement statement, capital contribution. So that's what it is. It isn't anything that seller can control. It is something that if the buyer was interested in knowing about, should have investigated the HOA a little more thoroughly, although it gets overlooked, and then would have been familiar with this as entering into this community. So, yes, the language in the contract, the language in the property disclosures cover this potential obstacle at closing. It's written in there. Everyone signed, everyone initialed. I can't tell you the conversations that were had on the other side. I can tell you conversations I had. And, everything that was done on the seller side looks to be completely in order, fully disclosed, and we have no control over that potential issue. So it didn't have a problem. The buyer had to pay the assessment, had to pay the capital contribution and move forward with the closing. They weren't going to have it cause a problem anyway. They were just disappointed that we didn't tell them about it. So again, communication's important, consultation's important, talking to your buyers about this is an HOA community, this is an amenities-based community. These typically have larger fees than other communities. The HOA is more involved. There's going to be, maybe you'll get notice if your yard isn't done. Maybe you have to have certain type of fencing. Maybe you have to have a capital contribution to even get in that exceeds typical communities. So this is, all on the buyer's side as far as I'm concerned. I'm not the sole expert, and I leave that up to the contract language. I leave that up to the attorneys. That's their job. And so we rely on them to help make our job easier. So that's one point. HOA, yes. In the HOA, it does support you in the language of the contract, recommending and knowing that buyer's due diligence is included when it comes to who's responsible for what duties and when. Another issue, can we depend on the contract to define closing? Yes. I think everyone is used to having, a little bit of everything's good feeling. The contracts are signed, we're under contract, we're past due diligence, we've negotiated, everyone's happy. Looks to be lenders on target, attorneys communicating, buyer's agent, seller's agent, all parties are keeping their arm's length away and working well. And then it's time for closing. We have closing come up. Here's something that can be an issue. I wanted to point it out. Conveyance date, section, paragraph 7 in the contract is conveyance date of closing / possession. I'll read this. Can there be issues at when the buyer takes possession of the home? Can be. There are several options. You can check at closing. You can check 24 hours after closing, 48 hours after closing, in accordance with an attached agreement. An attached agreement could be the seller needs more time to get out. However, the buyer wants to close earlier than when the sellers can get out, so there may be a separate agreement about lease back or rent back for certain prorated amounts for, let's say, 7 days after closing. The seller will remain, pay such and such amounts to the purchaser so that there's no lost money. But typically, when we close, you sign the documents, you get the keys. The buyer's happy, the seller's moved out. It's an easy transition. That's ideal. But let me go back and read this again. Conveyance will be made subject to all easements and covenants of record, and to all governmental statutes, ordinances, rules, and regulations. The seller agrees to convey by marketable title and to have prepared a general warranty deed, if applicable, free of encumbrances, except as herein stated. The deed will be prepared in the names of blank. This is where the purchasers put who they want the deed to be recorded in as they take possession. And then it says, or as otherwise stipulated by buyer and delivered to stipulated place of closing. That would be the attorneys here in South Carolina. And it says the deed will be held in trust by the closing attorney until sales proceeds have been dispersed to seller. That's what I want to highlight. So we think when you sign a document, everyone's happy, that's the end of the deal. Well, that may be the end of you signing documents, but the lender is going to review a fair amount of those closing documents. They're going to release the funds to the attorney's office for distribution. Then the attorneys have to turn around, pay off any invoices that might be along with the contract or repairs. They might have to, they're going to obviously pay off the seller's mortgage or liens against the property so that they can transfer title or record the deed. But this is the point I want to make here, is it says that the deed will be held in trust by closing attorney until sales proceeds have been dispersed to seller, at which time the closing attorney shall be authorized to record the deed. Important. So it's not closed. The deal's not closed when you sign the documents. The deal's not closed when the lender sends the money and says, okay, looks good. We're going to send the money on over to the attorney. The attorney can disperse. The deal is closed when the disbursement goes to the seller, right? So you give me my money, you get the house. That's how it reads, literally. So if, for instance, you have a late closing in the afternoon, close to 5, everyone signs their documents, and we've checkmarked at closing as defined in paragraph 2, which is the option of conveyance and possession. It says, what is paragraph 2C? Let's scroll on up. 2C says this, closing. What is the definition of closing? In this contract, closing is defined as the date and time that the closing attorney disperses funds. Period. That's the definition of closing. So I've had times when I'm representing a vacant home, properties have moved out of area, possibly out of country, and I'm their property manager / all-around handyman, lawnmower, so on and so forth. And, they're at arm's length. They're further than arm's length at this point. And I have keys, I have remotes, we're under contract. A lot of times the seller instructs me to deliver the keys and the remotes and any supporting documents or whatever. Sometimes sellers leave nice little things behind or have lots of information about various appliances and roof warranty and termite bonds and various things that might want to be communicated at closing. And so I'll go to the attorney and say, here, Mr. and Mrs. Attorney, this is the seller's closing packets, everything that the buyer would need once the property and transaction is closed. I will then instruct the attorney that you cannot release these items until the transaction is finalized or fully closed. I take my emotions out of it. I take my responsibility out of it. The sellers, they're in a different part of the country. They're not worried about, but what they don't want is the property not to have fully closed. We know what closing means. It means disbursement of funds, specifically to the seller. What we don't want to have happen is Everyone's nice, everyone's friendly. Here's your keys, buyer. Go ahead, you signed your documents, move right in. And let's say it's a 4:45 closing in the afternoon. Well, that disbursement may not happen until the next business day. And God forbid it's a Friday. And what if those funds don't disperse until Monday? Well, it's not closed. Simple. So the buyer has no property rights under the contract to take possession of that home just because they signed their part of the deal. So again, arm's length. Mr. and Mrs. Attorney, here's the seller's items. They're not around. I'm managing the deal. I'm going to verify that the buyer signed all their paperwork. You don't need anything else from us. I'm going to ask you, have the funds been dispersed? I'm going to keep an eye out for proceeds. My sellers are keeping an eye out for proceeds. But if that doesn't happen the day of closing, then you please do not give these keys or this remote or any possession to these buyers. We don't, I'm sure they're great people, everyone's good, but you need to protect your clients. I'm sure this is all in here because things have gone south. I've had an experience with this recently where I'm pushing my sellers, you gotta get out, work harder. Today's closing date, get that last stuff out of here. We're all working towards closing, trying to be, fair, trying to be good to the other side of the deal. It looked like my folks were going to be delayed in getting out as far as they needed to come back after signing, get one more load, roll on out. But it was taking a little bit more time. Now, the purchaser wanted to have a late closing because of their schedule, closed around 5 p.m. No proceeds were dispersed. So ultimately, according to the contract language, there's not been a closing yet. So the sellers, even though I'm pushing them, hey, buyer needs to get in here tonight. You guys are running a little bit behind. Let's go. Let me help you. I roll up my sleeves, started grabbing boxes. Ultimately, if the buyer wanted to get very upset about it and said, hey, why aren't you out yet? I'm on my way over. Let's go, which is fair. I understand that point of view. I let my clients know earlier in the day, well, hey, this is a late closing. If things are rough for you, you just can't get out, let me know. We may have to take another alternative. We may ask if we can, do a lease back for a couple days. Ultimately, if this doesn't get dispersed today, you really don't have to be out of the house. It's still your house until funds have been dispersed. That's the language in the contract. It's clear. There's no debating that. Again, I'm not the attorney. I would let the attorneys handle that argument, but from what I can tell and from my experience, that is the case. So, contract language can protect you. You need to know it, you need to understand it, and you need to advise your clients. Buyers have a lot of responsibility when they're purchasing a home. Sellers do, but their side is more simplified, other than gathering up all their possessions, getting them out of the home, getting the house nice and presentable for the new owners. All that is great. We want everything to work smoothly. We want everyone to be happy, stay friendly, stay professional. You may have things come up. Know your language. Know how to advise your clients. Protect yourself. Protect their best interests. And just do your best to have a smooth transaction. Ultimately, we want everyone to be happy, have a new home. It's a great start for some people. It's a great change for others. And we want everyone to really enjoy the experience. That's my advice for today. Contract language can protect you. Trust it, know it, and get out there and do some business the second half of the year. Thanks so much, guys.